next to getting paid to play SimCity like I do, the firefighting was probably the best job I've had. All right, so today's presentation, we'll start off with some wildfire evacuation planning guidance. We'll get into the details of the analysis, the modeling. We'll go through a case study from an actual project looking at the public outreach efforts as well as the analysis associated. And then we'll wrap it up with some operational strategies and improvements. So we'll probably be about 35, 40 minutes of presentation, and then we'll have plenty of time to have questions and discussion afterwards. For those of you online, if you do have questions, feel free to put them into the chat, and then we could address those when we get to the end. All right, so starting off with evacuation planning guidance, kind of why now? We're starting to see more and more agencies interested in understanding evacuations, and no surprise, we've seen a lot of these types of headlines in the news over the past few years. With climate change, we have increased drought, extreme temperatures, and a long history of fire suppression with our forests. So we just have really dense fuel loading, and so when things do ignite, they tend to go big. So, and then those of you here in Oregon may remember 2020, if you're here in 2020, when half the state seemed to be burning. You know, fortunately, we haven't had that scale since, but there's a good likelihood that that's going to come about. California in particular seems to be ahead of the curve when it comes to wildfire evacuation planning. So a lot of what we're going to talk about today is kind of California based, but I feel this is sort of what's on the verge of coming to Oregon. So these graphics here come from Cal Fire, and I like this one here on the left. This is the last 90 years of wildfire history in the state of California. And 6 of the 7 largest fires have been since 2020. And you can see that over half of the acreage burnt in California has really been in the past couple of years, a third of it between 2020 and 2019. So you can see that really starting to escalate. You know, a lot of the work that we do with planning the urban interface, you have the WUI, the wildland urban interface. And as we start expanding more into that, we put more structures at risk. And here you can see the numbers of structures destroyed over the past 5 or 6 years in California has gone up quite significantly. So in terms of wildfire planning guidance, what's relevant to your jurisdiction, a great resource is Community Wildfire Planning Center. So that's communitywildfire.org. You can go to their website and click on each state, and then it'll give you the state-specific guidance, as well as national resources. So you can see here in Oregon, we have, again, I just mentioned the WUI, the Wildland Urban Interface. You'll see a lot of wildfire planning is around that term, the Wildland Urban Interface. So the Oregon State Fire Marshal's Office has some prevention and planning resources. There's also Senate Bill 762, which requires the state to produce the wildfire risk maps and provide resources for creating fire-adapted communities. California, you can see, has 6 different resources here. Again, a lot of it is on that wildland urban interface, but they also have a little bit more on the regulation side. So we're going to dive into that. So in California, they have general plans. It's kind of like a, I guess it's more broad than, say, our transportation system plans here in Oregon, but it's a long-range visioning plan for local communities. So it could be at a city or a county level. And part of that plan is a safety element. And so there's some legislation here to add some disaster preparedness efforts into those elements. So as agencies update, they're required to include this. So one is Senate Bill 99. It requires that they identify residential developments that only have one ingress, egress, so that they don't have at least 2. The other one, Assembly Bill 747 and 1409, require that the element identify evacuation routes, and then the details are on the words here, and their capacity, safety, viability, and evacuation locations under a range of emergency scenarios. So these might not just be for wildfire. It could be for tsunami, flooding, any number of disasters. but it specifically says that you need to assess the capacity and the viability of those routes. So that's where California is really ahead of the game, because now agencies are required to look at evacuations. Since those have come out, there's been some guidance over the past couple of years to better help planners and engineers understand how to account for those. So how to assess that safety, how to assess that capacity. The California Office of Planning and Research, OPR, has the Evacuation Planning Technical Advisory for the General Plan. And so this gets into each of those different elements, as well as a range of others for the general plan, but it gets into those details of how do you do that analysis. And one of the things that they recommend is traffic simulation for evacuation viability. Another great guidance document is the State Attorney General's Office has best practice for analyzing and mitigating wildfire impacts of development projects under the California Environmental Quality Act, otherwise known as CEQA. So they also recommend evacuation modeling and planning. There's a bullet list here that I'm not going to read of all the different elements that should be considered in that evacuation planning. And a lot of those elements we'll talk about as we go through the different elements of the analysis. All right, so starting off, you want to figure out what your evacuation scenario is. So on that scenario development side. So you might want to assess what happens if this particular fire breaks out. What does the evacuation look like? So you're responding to a particular fire scenario. Or you might have an area that you might need to evacuate, and you want to understand what does that evacuation look like for that particular area under a range of different scenarios. So if you're going to analyze a specific wildfire scenario, that's where I'd recommend that you seek the advice of fire professionals. There's lots of consultants out there that specialize in fire behavior, but the local fire agencies also know best. They have particular fires that, it's basically what keeps them up at night. And then as part of that, you may consider fire modeling, so you actually understand the spread and the rate of those fires. If you are going to that level, then you want to consider what the fire scenario parameters are. That's going to be your origin, direction of the fire, the rate of spread, the season, and the time of day. Once you understand that, then you can move on to developing an actual evacuation scenario. And so this is, again, you're either responding to that specific wildfire scenario, or you're selecting an area that you want to evacuate. And then you come up with an evacuation order. So in the event of a real fire, an evacuation order might be put into place. And so it's going to be not just one agency making that decision. It's a group of agencies from fire, and usually it's led by a sheriff's office or Office of Emergency Services kind of leads that. But they're the ones that are going to set the specific inputs or parameters relative to that evacuation. So those evacuation scenario parameters are generally going to be defining your evacuation and warning zone boundaries. So the evacuation zone is the mandatory evacuation. So everybody in there has to evacuate. Often a lot of folks don't, but it's at least a mandatory evacuation. And then that's going to be surrounded by a warning zone. So a warning zone might be just providing additional notice time, letting people know, hey, there's a fire in the area. We may need to expand the boundary here. It just gives individuals more time. But often with that case, people will voluntarily leave at the same time as the evacuation order. We saw that locally here in Oregon with the 2020 fires. Molalla and Malino were under mandatory evacuation. And then they put Oregon City, the urban area, in the warning zone. And people panicked. Everybody started leaving the warning zone and clogged up the evacuation routes for Malino and Molalla. So making sure that your analysis includes that larger geographic area is important. The evacuation destination, so where are people evacuating to? It could be a specific shelter. It could be just into more of an urban area. Road closures for evacuation. These could be specific because a road is on fire and people can't evacuate that way. or you could be using road closures to prevent background traffic from going particular directions. And then evacuation departure duration. Are we trying to evacuate in 30 minutes, 60, 2 hours? What is the time that we're trying to consider here? And then relaying back to those fire scenario parameters, even if you're not doing a specific fire, understanding the season in which you're trying to evacuate. So, you know, it could be a fall weekend. What does that mean for the population? We'll talk a little bit more about this, but that could impact basically who's in the evacuation area based on the time of day and the season. Then off to the side here, this is an example for one of the projects I worked on. We had set up a virtual incident command center. And so the fire teams, and we had some local fire agencies, County Fire, Cal Fire, Office of Emergency Services. They provided 4 specific fire scenarios that they were interested in better understanding. And then similar to if it was a real situation, OES, again, Office of Emergency Services, provided the exact evacuation orders for those fires. We also had city and county public works staff. We had Caltrans there. We worked with a whole range of crew to develop these scenarios that ultimately became our inputs for our models. And that just helps you kind of root your analysis in something that's realistic and defensible. So for the evacuation modeling approach, this, I'll just kind of preface, this is one way to do it. If you really want to capture that capacity, that viability of some evacuation routes, having a simulation-based dynamic traffic assignment model, DTA model, is helpful in understanding those. In particular, a lane-based DTA model, because there's also link-based models, but a lane-based allows you to, say, code in an extra turn pocket at an intersection and see what that capacity improvement is on the evacuation results. Evacuation demand. So we put in the unique populations that we have that we need to evacuate, households, employees, visitors, whatever sector of the population you need to evacuate. Departure time distributions. So there are some survey data available out there that basically show once an evacuation order is put into place, how quickly do people respond before they depart? And it's different for different population groups. So households are generally slower. People are gathering their belongings, getting things packed up. And so at first there's not many people evacuating, and then it's a sharper spike. Somebody, so you have an area with a lot of tourists or employees, they're generally going to drop what they're doing and leave right away. So it's a much upfront, sharper peak. So we'll run the assignment. We'll have the route choice is based dynamically. So as congestion builds on one route, an evacuee may choose to take another route, similar to if you're using Google Maps or Waze. We're using really short assignment intervals, so 10 to 15 minutes here, because these, you know, as quick as the traffic spikes, we want the model to be able to respond to that. And then evacuation destinations. So the ultimate destination may be an hour or 2 away, and we're not going to build the model that big. So we'll generally have evacuation destination directions, so kind of key gateways around the edge of the model. But ultimately, we're modeling the complete roadway system, the capacity. We're modeling the nuances of that evacuation order, so if there's any road closures. In one example, the sheriff basically said, we need the road closure, but we can't get it in place by the start of the evacuation order. And so we kind of did a sensitivity test of initially we set it up 30 minutes after the start of the order. And then with a short evacuation period, we still had traffic backed into the evacuation zone by the time the fire arrived. So we ended up cutting that down, is pretty much they had to have that in 10 minutes to be able to get the evacuation traffic out of the way, or the background traffic out of the way of the evacuation traffic. So all those time dynamics is really the key important part of modeling the wildfire evacuation. The insights that we gained from this, evacuation time estimates, so understanding that time to clear the evacuation zones, travel time to key destinations or gateways, because often the bottlenecks are far downstream from the immediate evacuation zone. Identification of resource needs, so how many traffic control officers do you need to control the intersections? And then identification of infrastructure projects to better facilitate evacuation. So this is hard to see because it's just hard to get a brighter shot of this. And I wasn't able to get a high resolution video, but this is a screenshot from the VZOOM SBA simulation-based assignment model. Again, a mesoscopic simulation here, so we are able to visualize the vehicle trajectories. This accounts for queuing, queue spill back between intersections. You can see we have the signals operating here. And it's not to the level of a micro simulation where you're modeling individual driver behavior and individual vehicles to that extent. So it allows you to run these scenarios much quicker. And as I mentioned, the bottlenecks are often far downstream, and that was the case here. So the freeway where you see that the pink cars queued up and then the arterial off to the side. This is quite a ways away from the evacuation zone, but it's a pretty substantial bottleneck as all of the evacuation routes are kind of funneling down to the main highway there. And basically, as evacuees are evacuating, they're choosing routes to start to get around these bottlenecks. And so that kind of gives us a baseline. We see where things are, and then from there we can start developing operational strategies or infrastructure improvements. So some further modeling considerations is, what is the capacity of a roadway system during an evacuation? There's a lot of stuff going on, and generally you're not going to have ideal traffic flow rates during an evacuation. You're going to have some sort of capacity reduction factor. You might have extreme limited visibility due to smoke. You have emergency vehicles responding in the other direction, so vehicles are pulling over to let them by. You may have increased number of large vehicles, horse trailers, cargo trailers, RVs, and just a general heightened state of drivers. So there is definitely a reduction in capacity. This is an area where I think, we could definitely use more research, but it also is going to be kind of specific from location to location, depending on your lane widths and your shoulders and just the general environment. That capacity reduction may vary. So this is where having some sensitivity testing is often helpful. Understanding the populations that you need to evacuate. Livestock properties, for example, if you have horse boarding properties, they generally don't have enough trucks and trailers on site to move all the animals. So they have to call in assistance. And so that takes some time. Loading the animals takes some time. So their evacuation timeline, it's going to be hard to get it out of there faster than 4 to 5 if you have a large facility. Other vulnerable populations. So often you have care facilities, hospitals, schools. There's lots of different vulnerable populations that you need to consider. They will need assistance during the evacuation, but they may not be considered in the model. So there are strategies for assisting these populations, and you want to definitely include that in the narrative of your study, provide recommendations, but it may not be, again, directly captured in the model.
Hey, Randy, real quick. There was a question in the chat. Do you want to take questions after you're done, or?
I could take a quick question, but we could say.
The question was, what source or how did you come up with a 20 to 50% capacity reduction?
So that's why I said there's very little information on this, and that's why I provided a broad range. Other studies I've seen are right around 40. We use something similar. We talked quite a bit with the county and CAL FIRE that went through a lot of evacuations and getting their general observations during back when we started this fire, or started this particular project. Just after that, one of those 6 biggest fires in California history, the Caldor fire, had started. So a lot of this crew was just fresh off of a mega fire. And they kind of reached consensus and agreed on that 40% as that range that they wanted to test. But if, anybody in the room has specific research on that, I think that's a need that we have in the resilience planning community.
Cool. There was another question, but let's move forward.
Yeah.
And we'll answer, put your questions in the chat if you're online, and we'll take the rest of them towards the end so we don't disrupt and just flow here too much.
Let's see where. Oh, the other is, do you need to consider compounding effects? So fire season often overlaps with construction season. So do you have detours and lane closures on key evacuation routes? What happens if the fire breaks out while those are in place? Can you avoid lane closures during red flag warnings? So those are things to think about. Another one is, are you doing evacuation for a new development? So not just assessing the current condition. With that, I'd recommend that you do a baseline, kind of a with and without project. That allows you to determine the viability of the particular development for evacuation, as well as the impact of that development on the community's ability to evacuate. So again, everybody's kind of in the industry cutting their teeth on this. There's not a lot of hard guidance on evacuation planning for private development with specific thresholds like we have when we do traffic impact analysis. And you know, a development, for example, might have to do a traffic impact study if it generates 50 or more vehicles. And then there's, you know, clear mobility targets or VMT thresholds that it needs to meet. We don't have those quite so much. I know there's multiple agencies working on that right now. We're likely to see some in California by the end of the year. And then I imagine the Northwest will lag probably a year or two behind that. And then lastly, are there near-term planned developments and road projects? So similar to doing a traffic impact analysis, is there something that's going to be built in the near future that could impact the outcome? Should you consider that? All right, on the software and data side, so I mentioned and showed that brief video clip. So we use the PTV Vizoom SBA model. Another equivalent product would be Bentley's Dynamec, another lane-based DTA product. So both of those provide that ability to really assess the capacity, include the time dynamics. For these, though, you really need to code it down to the intersection level. So you're coding signals, stop signs, roundabouts, turn lanes, turn-based storage length, because all of those will impact your queuing and operations at intersections. Speeds. A lot of these are in kind of semi-rural areas. If you have a lot of topography, narrow roads, steep curves, even though the road may be posted at 35, the effective speed may be something like 20 or 15 miles an hour. And so either for large segments or short segments, you may need to kind of calibrate that speed. And then you'll set up your origin destination matrices for both evacuation traffic and the background traffic as those intermix. There's a lot of data that can feed these models, and there are multiple ways this can be done. For the evacuation demand, our analysis has often been weekends, and so we're relying on census data and replica data to get season and date specific information. A travel demand model is more based on peak period traffic operations and traffic flows and doesn't necessarily represent the total evacuation demand. For building in the background traffic, that's more like a regular traffic study. You're trying to build it to a particular condition. Again, it could be on a weekend, and your travel demand model may be weekday only. But you know, in California, you have the PEMS data. Here in Oregon, we have the RIDIS data available, replica, streetlight count data, just all your typical sources for getting traffic volume information. And then on the model validation, again, we're not trying to replicate like a particular typical peak condition. And so the calibration is a little more challenging. So often we'll do a visual calibration. And because we're doing a mesoscopic simulation, we still want to make sure we're getting reasonable flow rates through stop signs, through merge areas on freeway ramps. And so we might do kind of a quick back check with HCM tool to either at the intersection or segment level, understand the flow rates that we're getting, and just kind of as a gut check relative to HCM, how do those compare and are they reasonable? Okay, jumping into our case study. So this will cover both the public outreach part of the project as well as the analysis. This is for the Greater Placerville Wildfire Preparedness Study. And so this is a project we've been working on the past couple of years. It actually goes to the board for approval on Thursday. So you're getting a bit of a sneak preview on this. This one, notice it's the Wildfire Evacuation Preparedness Study. Originally, this was called a plan, and the Office of Emergency Services was very adamant that we do not call this a plan, that we do not identify specific evacuation routes. They don't want the community to rely on that because they will define the evacuation plan for a specific emergency. So we had to make sure everything was referred to as study. So throughout this project, we had a lot of project partners. So fire agencies, emergency services on the sheriff's side, local cities, county. So we had public works staff, planning staff. We had health services, education services, all the utilities, U.S. Forest Service. So we had a lot of project partners that reviewed and provided comment throughout this process. A lot of public outreach sessions. So down in California, they have in certain areas fire safe councils, basically groups that help better prepare wildfire, prepare the community for wildfire preparedness. And so we would present at each of the fire safe councils. Had a project website and did some online outreach as well using Social Pinpoint that allowed citizens to go through, place comments, identify areas of concern, make comments specific to those concerns, and then even suggest some ideas to help out the study. And we did incorporate some of that into our technical analysis, just to show one example here. Again, I mentioned a lot of the evacuation was heading down to the highway, kind of the east-west backbone on US 50. In this segment, there is a parallel corridor, the Pony Express Trail. It's an arterial, actually is the old Pony Express Trail. And one of the citizen comments was, hey, how about you close the road here at this location, here on the east side, force everybody onto US 50 just to relieve some capacity downstream to help those folks evacuate. And so we ran that scenario in the model, and that provided a meaningful difference, and that ultimately became one of our recommended strategies. So, you know, the citizens know best the neighborhoods that they live in. They know these back roads and areas that are likely to be issues. And so you really want to tap into that. So I mentioned before, our study, we did a specific fire scenario. You know, we could have done these of evacuating the same area, but responding to fires in different areas and closing roads to cover those bases. So in this case, we had a fire burning down in the canyon, burning kind of southwest. The area in red here is the evacuation zone. So that's the mandatory evacuation. In yellow, that's the warning zone. So in this one, I think we did a 25%, is either 25 or 50, I forget off the top of my head. But OES provided some guidance on how much of the warning zone population they wanted to see voluntarily evacuate. And so the big challenge with this particular area is this is what they call Apple Hill area. And so they have, through pretty much every weekend in the fall, it's wineries, pumpkin patches, orchards, and it is full of tourists from the valley every weekend. And so there are so many tourists in there. So we ran this at a Saturday in October. We relied on that replica data to understand that level of demand. We also had there's a lot of employment associated with all that tourism, agritourism. And so we included that as well. And then US 50 is the main connection between Sacramento and Tahoe. And so that's a major connection. They felt at that time of day on that type of season, they wouldn't be able to close US 50 because they want to allow traffic to evacuate in both directions. So OES said US 50 is going to be open, and that kind of set the stage for what we needed to include in the models. Now, the charts aren't terribly exciting to look at, but these are some of the important numbers that come out of it. The figure in the top left was kind of filtered down just to show some of the key evacuation routes. At the bottom, the chart, bottom left here, the chart is showing the cumulative percentage of evacuation traffic. Basically, what is the time to clear that evacuation zone? So I mentioned the reduced capacity that you want to consider. We did the bookend of looking at it with the full capacity and the reduced capacity. So you can see after 1 hour, and the fire spread period was about 2 hours to reach the far side of the evacuation zone. So an hour in, we're about 77 to 80% evacuated. At 2 hours, we're 96 to 98%. Then under the full capacity, we get everybody out by 2 hours, 15 minutes. And then under the reduced capacity, it takes an additional 15 just to get those last few folks out. Because you always have a few people that leave right towards the end of that period. So we also looked at travel time, not just to clear that evacuation zone, but to kind of clear the general area, because some of those evacuation bottlenecks are, like I said, considerable distance from the evacuation zone itself. So the figure on the top right is the travel time to clear the general area based on full capacity. On the bottom is based on the reduced capacity. Maximum travel times were 55 minutes under the full capacity, and they jumped to a little over 2 hours, 125 minutes under the reduced capacity. So that capacity reduction factor does make a big difference. And again, it's definitely an area that we could use some more research on. All right, getting into our last section here, the operational strategies and infrastructure projects. So with this project, we ended up mapping out all the locations where we identified operational strategies and infrastructures improvements to help facilitate evacuation. Some of the locations served to benefit under multiple fire scenarios, and that helped us prioritize projects. Some of them were intersection specific. Most of them were a bottleneck at an intersection. But some of them, like US 50, you can see we have this red line through here. That's where we have the biggest bottleneck. The highway is 2 lanes until it reaches that west end, and then it picks up a 3rd lane. And so that's where we have recommended an evacuation lane. And so we'll talk about that here in a couple slides. Operational strategies. So this is any type of manual traffic control. Generally, it's going to be National Guard or a sheriff's office flagging traffic through a signal or a stop sign. They might have roadblocks to either prevent traffic from entering an evacuation area or preventing background traffic from mixing with the evacuation flow. One other option for an operational strategy is evacuation-specific signal timing. That, of course, has certain requirements to make that effective, and we'll talk about that in a couple of slides. Infrastructure improvement. So the goal here is ultimately to reduce bottlenecks along evacuation routes and identify the number of resources that you need to manually control traffic. So a lot of these semi-rural communities only have so many resources, and through this process, you could identify that, hey, you're gonna need at least 8 officers to control traffic at these locations, and that might be quite a strain. And so are there any of these locations that there's an easy infrastructure improvement that might lessen that need for a manual resource? So there's a long list of improvements that you could do to better facilitate evacuation on the infrastructure side. This is just kind of a select sample that I wanted to share. One of those is providing secondary egress to any limited access community. So often it's hard politically, physically to get a second access point, getting easements. So one method, you may still run into the same political challenges or physical challenges, environmental challenges. But one option might be to use a multi-use path that you design that to a bigger standard. So a little bit wider width, deeper depth, that you could accommodate a fire apparatus or vehicle traffic if needed. So every day, 99% of the time, hopefully 100% of the time, it's just a bike path, multi-use path. But if you need it, you can use that as an emergency vehicle evacuation route. Buffered bike lanes. So another way to get an additional lane of traffic without actually widening the roads is put an extra large buffered bike lane in there. So if you have even as narrow as 9, would be more effective at 10 or 11 foot, especially if you have forced trailers and stuff you need to get out. Having that total width for a buffered bike lane to be in that 10-foot range will provide you that additional lane of capacity. Converting stop signs to traffic signals or roundabouts. Again, we'll come back to these in detail, but stop signs are a very common bottleneck location for evacuations. Contrafill lanes. So making a road all go one direction, all lanes one direction. So in our particular study, the agencies were adamant they do not want to consider contraflow operations. The amount of resources to take to make that happen was just something that they weren't interested in even considering. So there are places that have that in their plans. There are places that have implemented that successfully. But before you start testing that, that might be something worthwhile of talking with the emergency professionals to see if that's something that's even on the table. And then a hard shoulder lane or an evacuate lane, using the shoulder as an additional lane of capacity. So one big consideration though is, sure, you could widen a lot of these facilities, get more throughput for an evacuation, but you definitely want to balance that capacity need versus any induced VMT, overbuilding capacity resulting in any negative safety impacts. So that's why a lot of these strategies up here try to minimize that inducing VMT and safety impact. So some examples here, on the left is US 50. So this is the one from our study, and this is probably one of the larger improvements that we're recommending out of this study. And so we're pushing a little over, at the peak, probably 5,000 to 6,000 vehicles per hour that we're trying to get down US 50, and we have 2 lanes. So today it's about a 2 to 3 foot left shoulder, 2 12 to 13 foot travel lanes, and about a 9 foot right shoulder. So similar strategy used throughout Texas between the coastal communities and the inland cities is an evacuate lane, hurricane evacuation route. And so you can see here they have about a foot to 18-inch left shoulder with a rumble strip, 2 11-foot travel lanes, and then 11-foot shoulder. And you can also see the rumble strip off to the side here is moved into the middle of the lane. So that way traffic can drive on it without driving on the rumble strip. So this example in Texas is actually about 2 feet wider than the existing pavement width, or sorry, 2 feet narrower than the existing pavement width that we have on US 50. So we ran this by Caltrans, and this was something that they were very supportive as an option to provide that additional capacity. And then FHWA has some guidance on how to deal with the striping when it comes to continuing that lane through on-ramps and off-ramps. And then roundabouts. So I mentioned at the top, one of my kind of key passion areas are roundabouts. I love roundabouts. We should get rid of every signal. So, and you'll see a lot of the evacuation guidance document talk about roundabouts because they work well without power. So often you don't have power during an evacuation, but roundabouts don't work in every situation, or you need to have some considerations for applying them. So going through some example screenshots here in the upper left, stop sign, this is a candidate for a queue backup during an evacuation. You could have some sort of resource out there flagging traffic through as one option, but maybe it's also a systemic safety issue. So, hey, you can build the roundabout, fix the safety issue, get better capacity and better flow for the evacuation. So roundabouts work well if it's a single flow direction or a diverging flow. So in this upper right corner here, you can see if you have a path where where traffic splits to diverge to go to 2 different evacuation destinations, generally you could get a pretty high flow rate. It's when you have conflicting evacuation paths that converge at a roundabout that you have to consider. So in this case here, the example from the right, this traffic is largely unimpeded and it's going to result in a backup for this southbound leg. So you could still have a roundabout here during an evacuation, but it's just going to need somebody to flag that intersection to hold off that leg to allow that southbound leg. I have this example to the right in Tahoe. I don't know if this was specifically designed for wildfire evacuation or probably more so just for capacity with tourist season. But you can see here how the left turn and the through movement, there's a bypass lane at this T intersection. So each leg can equally enter the roundabout, and then you're going to have a zipper merge at the lane drop downstream, which that'll be a bit of a bottleneck location, but you're at least providing equal service to those 2 legs. So again, roundabouts are a great solution. You just have to kind of work through these nuances to see what the best application is. And then signals. I mentioned I'd come back to signals and ITS. One other great recommendation is at these key evacuation route junctions, having remote roadside cameras and weather stations. Now, again, power is an issue. You might have a public safety power shut off. We're starting to see the power companies do those more and more. So you want to make sure you have a backup power system. You want to make sure that you have a cellular modem for connection, or your powered fiber line. And so that's a great way to see what the fire weather behavior is, to see what traffic conditions are. Is there a queue at this location or not? And then same goes for the traffic signals. So you could increase green times to better facilitate evacuation, but again, you need power and you need the ability to change those timings. So, excuse me. So in the 2020 fires that we had here in Oregon, another story from Clackamas County is traffic was massively backed up. They were struggling to get cars through. And I think it was one of the signal guys from Clackamas County lived close to an ODOT signal. They had a key. They were able to ride their bike out there because they wouldn't have been able to drive there, but ride their bike out there, get in the cabinet and make the changes on the fly. So you may either run into cases you don't have power or you don't have the ability to physically get there. But if you have a central signal system, backup power supply, and maybe even to save some time, some predetermined high flow, high green time direction in one movement, you could easily switch to these timing plans during an evacuation. Oh, and on the cameras, another story from the 2020 fires that we had here. Most of the Central Cascades fire line or the power lines were all burned out. There was just no power. On Highway 26 corridor, PGE did a public safety power shut off. They killed power to the entire corridor. But you could still go to ODOT's Trip Check website and see the camera at the Hoodview fire station. And that's because that one was tied into the fire backup power system for the fire station there. And so that was extremely helpful to be able to see what the conditions were at that location during those events. And then just to wrap up the last couple of slides here, nothing exciting to look at here, but getting these infrastructure projects and operational strategies documented for the need, identifying how many resources that you need or how many resources you could save from these, getting planning level cost estimates. And ultimately the goal here is to then link that up with funding sources. There's a variety of grant sources. And maybe you have an ITS project to upgrade your signal system, but this now shines a different type of light. And so with that resiliency spotlight on it, maybe it opens up a project to new pots of money to be able to, show that the benefits of these systems aren't just for daily operations, but they could be helpful in an evacuation situation as well. So with that, I will conclude my presentation.
Awesome. Thanks so much.
Yeah.
We have a couple questions in the chat, so let's take those. And then if folks in the room have questions or other people online, if you have questions, yeah, please put them in the chat. So the first one asked about the 4 to 5 hour estimate for livestock. Is there anything behind that estimate? Where did that come from?
So that estimate, I came across a study that included that rough time frame of 4 to 5 hours. And then I also talked with Donna Odermuth, which many of you may know is a local traffic engineer here that also runs a large horse boarding ranch, and talked about his and he lives kind of up in the forested hills, and asked him about his evacuation plan. And he said that's dead on the money about the amount of time it would take to get all the trailers and trucks that they would need. They have contingency plans to, if they just have to let the horses go, they have to, but they have plans of how many trucks and who they can call to get all those horses out of there at one time.
Gotcha. Thanks. And then a follow-up regarding bottlenecks, the information that the emergency responders will use to begin, for instance, opening all lanes out of the affected area for egress. So like when you find, it sounds like the question is related to the modeling of the bottlenecks and how the information is being used in the emergency responders.
Yeah, so that's where we develop the operational strategies or infrastructure improvements. And I didn't show any of the figures, I guess, in the slide here, but to see how that would reduce the evacuation times. And so now for those particular fire scenarios, the sheriff's office knows what are the most critical bottlenecks that they need to get somebody out there. But in this area, particular area, so topographically constrained, like widening would mean retaining walls and taking out historic homes. And so it's really about just increasing the flow with the lanes that you have. That shoulder lane on US 50 was about the best we could do with adding capacity, emergency capacity.
Gotcha. Thanks. Another question about level of effort and budget for an evaluation DTA study. It does seem like quite a bit of work.
Yeah, it certainly was. These studies, depending on the size and the inputs and the number of scenarios, can range from, 20,000 to several 100,000. In this particular case, the public outreach was a pretty significant component. A lot of the coordination and the number of scenarios, and this was a pretty large geographic area. So this one was a several 100,000, including the public outreach piece.
Yeah, it certainly seems like just the modeling itself would take a lot of time. So all
Yeah,
the other
for sure.
components would also be quite time consuming. Some more chat questions here. Are the traffic evacuation times considering accidents or stalled vehicles? I imagine that has to do with some of that reduced capacity assumption.
Yeah, that's part of it. A car runs out of gas. I mean, the other consideration is as we electrify our fleet, realizing people might run out of a charge. So something like a vehicle breaking down in a lane, vehicles have to go out and around that. That would be kind of accounted for in that capacity reduction. You would have to run a specific scenario as if there was, a truck flipped over and is now blocking a road mid-evacuation. That would be a specific scenario that you would set up and run.
Yep. Last question in the chat, and then I'll take some for the room here. Are there concerns about the current conditions of the infrastructure in Oregon? I'm not quite sure what infrastructure that refers to, if that's just roadway or traffic signals or what. And this study was down in California, so I'm not sure if you have any perspective you can share on that.
I mean, really, a lot of the communities are similar. I mean, from Ashland to Oak Ridge to Bend and Sisters, they're all high-risk areas, generally one way in, one way out highways. So providing the best connectivity that you can. And really, it's making sure that you have the ability to facilitate the highest flow that you can out of these areas. And so that's where you could assess it. Do you need to have a shoulder lane? Can you make it function without it, or do you need that?
Thanks. So I do have some more questions in the chat. I want to make sure folks in the room here, if you have questions, that you're able to.
Yeah. Thanks, Randy. It was a great presentation, and kind of tailing off that last question, something that struck me, you said a couple times, was like maintaining 2 egress points.
Mm-hmm.
So in case one's blocked, you grab another. Do you know if, because it sounds like California had a state bill saying that, are folks starting to think about that in terms of like thinking like subdivisions, especially that have a lot of cul-de-sacs? And you mentioned like the multi-use path, that might be a way to connect to a different street, but are you seeing any changes in how we design our subdivisions?
For sure on the subdivisions. I haven't seen, because I do a fair amount of site development review here and haven't ran into the need to look at that in detail, but in California, you have to have a minimum of 2 like open public access points, and that spacing has to be at least half the distance of the diagonal of the property. So you can't have a really long skinny development and then 2 access points at the end of that.
Okay.
So you gotta take the diagonal of that, and the spacing has to be at least half that distance.
Okay.
And then like that SB 99 that identifies those neighborhoods, it doesn't necessarily provide the solution, but it provides areas that are in high hazard that don't have that connectivity, and just alerts agencies that these are high risk areas.
Okay.
Yeah. Daniel, Matt.
Thank you for the presentation. It's a very interesting topic. So I have a question. It's like some already asked it online. So say the accident, you say that's gonna count in the capacity reduction, right? So for some accident. So like my question is like, for example, if they're under the fire scenario, so maybe some roads they're gonna have some people maybe very scared about the fire. So maybe they will perform very differently. So for me, like I think the evacuation probably the most important factor is like to considering the people behavior, government behavior, right? So I just want to know, like, for example, the reduction capacity apply just for one evacuation operation, like options, or maybe you apply that for several roads as they can, reduction maybe 20% or maybe to like something like that, or you just apply to one road. So they say, so how did you count that into your model? And
In this case, we kept it simple and we did everything at full capacity and everything with a 40% as that bookend.
Mhm.
But if there's factors of, because there's a lot of roads in this particular county that are 9-foot lanes, deep shoulders, sharp hairpin turns. It wouldn't take much for, especially if somebody's towing a trailer, to get stuck and wedged in there and block it. So if you really wanted to go to that level, you could provide different factors for different facilities. But this particular study, we kept it just everything across the board. Yep.
And we ask one more, like you also mentioned like the data you input into your model, right?
Mhm.
So I see some slide you at the beginning, you say you have some distribution for the data. May I know what's the distribution you include in the uncertainty? Like for example, the probability distribution to input into the data, or you just input data from the database from the department? Did you consider any probability distribution into the data?
So, I mean, we didn't run like different probability models. So there's multiple surveys out there that basically show a departure time distribution based on population groups, whether it's employees or households. And that's where I mentioned the curve is very slow to rise with households as folks are gathering their belongings. People that aren't tied to a particular property are generally out of there much faster. So that curve moves up front a little bit.
Yeah, a couple related to the chat. One person asked if you could provide the source for those curves. If you had a reference.
I don't have it off the top of my head, but there's a couple different studies out there. City of Ashland, City of Sammamish had specific studies done.
Okay. And then Sarisha asked whether the model could be run in real time. So I'm assuming if there was an event and something, as you were mentioning, like there's a crash on one of the roads, could you run the model in real time to sort of inform other decisions? I don't know how long the model takes to run.
It runs pretty quick. I'm gonna kind of look over to Jayden here. I know PTV has done several studies of doing real-time modeling. It's theoretically possible.
Yeah, usually with the real-time model, what happens is the general, like the error in the model tends to compound in a more weird way.
Okay.
We go for real time. So that's the major thing that's still kind of unresolved, because here you want to consider en route detours. So when trips have already left, then their origin has changed from like when it was at the start of the simulation. Now you have to remap all of those origins and then reroute all of those trips on a new path.
Okay.
And that in itself is like, there are too many assumptions in there in terms of, so here the concept is more, you run the simulation and you get a certain equilibrium type solution, and that forms the basis of supporting a decision process for, so that's why they analyze different bottlenecks and what could happen beforehand that they could take care of to make the evacuation smoother. But real time causes another complexity, which is like error compounding, basically.
Thanks. So just for the folks who are listening virtually, just make sure you sort of caught the gist of that. Is I don't know how good the acoustics are in this room or the microphone, but trying to reassign those trips after the model run is kind of started, which is almost what you have to do, is really complicated and probably difficult to have a run like that happen without a lot of errors occur. So I don't know, Randy, do you have anything to add?
No, yeah,
Or
there's
specific language.
there's definitely a lot of challenges, and that would add
Yeah.
substantial expense to the project.
Yeah. Well, we're pretty much at time. And there was a question about sharing slides. I know if you're willing to share the slides, I can send them out to the attendees.
Yeah, we'll either get the slide deck and or the video of the presentation, assuming you got it recorded.
Yep.
We'll get that posted on the OregonITE.org website.
Yeah, that's right. So this was recorded, so the video will be available. I'll send out the link once we get it posted onto our YouTube account, and then I guess we'll hold off on the slides unless you want me to send those out separately.
We can just get it all posted at the same time on the website.
Awesome. Yeah, so